This podcast is part of the Big Heads Media Podcast Network. Go to bigheadsmedia.com for more great podcasts.
This is Mike.
And Beck.
And Nina.
And we are Brew Crime. So this episode we're going to cover wrongful convictions. It's people that went to jail that shouldn't have been there. Mm-hmm. All right, well, I'm actually going to start this time for probably the first time.
Woohoo.
Yeah, woohoo is right, yeah. This is a story of William Mullins-Johnson or Bill. For the beer pairing I've got today, we've got Beere Brewing's Mental Floss. It's a double dry hopped IPA, 7.9% alcohol, and it doesn't say anything on the can, really.
Ooh, I like the color of this one.
So this one definitely has got that murky orange color that you get from the New England style beers. Big pillowy white head on it. Kind of a fruity nose, kind of herbal. Sort of a mildly sweet aroma. Again, it's got that very vegetal, like grassy flavor coming from all the hops in it that kind of masks the juicy fruits that could be there. Bitterness isn't super high, but it's more like kind of resiny, bit dank.
I feel like we're really on for beers that I'll like.
Good.
Nina, you
Hazy,
fan?
fruity.
It's okay. It's very, very hoppy.
Yeah. It's not super bitter, but it is definitely hoppy, yeah. But if you're not used to the style...
Got the shivers.
Yeah, need a video of that. Spending 11 years in prison would be awful, but even more awful if you were wrongly convicted of a crime that did not occur.
It didn't occur.
On the evening of June 26, 1993, Bill, a 22-year-old, was babysitting his sister-in-law's kids. She needed someone to watch her 3 children, and they loved to stay with Bill as he was their favorite uncle. Valen was his 4-year-old niece. She had been running a fever that day, and as such, Bill and Valen had been sitting down all night to watch TV. Valen was tired and decided to head to bed, so she kissed her uncle goodnight and also gave him a hug. She then went up to her room and fell asleep. Bill would head upstairs to check on her about 30 minutes later, and he noticed that she was sleeping. With that, he headed back downstairs to the couch in the living room and fell asleep. Bill woke up the next day to someone running down the stairs crying and screaming. His sister-in-law, Kim, had headed up to check on Valen when she arrived home and noticed some vomit on the bed. This worried her, so she rolled her daughter over. Sadly, she was purple.
Oh, no.
Bill's brother would try to perform CPR, but sadly she had already died and rigor mortis had set in.
Oh, wow.
Her body was brought to the Sault Ste. Marie General Hospital in Ontario, where an autopsy was to be performed. The team of physicians, Dr. Budendra Rasaya, I think, Dr. Patricia Zaire, and now disgraced Charles Smith, would do an autopsy and bring their findings. They would claim that she was strangled, and Dr. Zahar, a gynecologist and obstetrician, concluded that she had been horribly sexually assaulted. With these findings, Bill was arrested on June 27th, 1993 at 6:30 p.m. He was charged with first-degree murder, aggravated sexual assault of his young niece. During an interrogation, the police kept screaming at me that they had evidence and I did this and that. With every accusation, I responded, I didn't do it. Bill has not wavered all these years about his innocence. Sadly, only one person in his family believed him, and that was his mother, Lorena. The rest of the family believed the quote-unquote expert judgments. Bill even started to believe that his brother may have murdered the child as he didn't do it. If the experts had been correct, the child had been murdered after all. At the trial of Bill Mullins-Johnson, expert witnesses were brought in to the stand. One such witness was now disgraced pathologist Charles Smith, who lost his license to practice. In the end, after 20 of 44 autopsies he performed that were reviewed, came up with substantial problems with their findings.
Fucking hell.
17 of these 44 in question actually put people in jail. He testified that Valin was abused and then suffocated to death. His evidence was bruises that were found on her neck, chest, and head. He would also claim that she was raped. On September 21st, 1994, the jury came to a conclusion. He was convicted of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 25 years. The jury had come to this decision even with the complete lack of physical evidence in this case.
I feel like that's how it always is.
Yeah.
In these
Yeah.
wrongful conviction cases, it's just like circumstantial. Yeah, sure. Guilty.
Yep.
Yep.
He was remanded to Jocelyn Institution near Kingston, Ontario. As he was a convicted sex offender, he received all kinds of death threats from other inmates. They took the threats seriously and held Bill in solitary confinement for 4 whole months. Moving on to 1995, he would be moved to a prison that houses sex offenders that are in protective custody named Wakeworth Institution, north of Toronto. I hate the fact that there's actually a fucking place to protect these guys. Now, this guy is innocent, but I hate there's a place there to protect sexual predators that are in protection.
I know
That's
what you're
gross.
saying, but it's because the other option is solitary confinement, which is inhumane for long periods of time.
Yeah, so are sexual predators, though. So
No, I don't disagree with
especially
you.
of children. So 2 appeals were filed in this case, with the first on December 19th, 1996. Of the 3 judges on the appeal board, only 1 disagreed with the decision to not allow a retrial. This judge was Justice Borens, and he is quoted as saying, "There was no forensic evidence connecting Bill to Valin. Although tests were conducted, there was no evidence that any bodily substances of Bill was on or in Valin's body." He also noted that of the 5 experts who testified, only Dr. Smith thought he saw evidence of, recent anal penetration. He says that he would have called for a retrial as there were too many limitations to the evidence that were used to convict Bill. The next appeal was on May 26, 1998, where it was unanimously dismissed for appeal. Bill would finally turn to the group Innocence Canada, formerly known as Defense of the Wrongfully Convicted, and they agreed to take his case. In February 2003, lawyer James Lockyer would write to the Crown Law Office to request that the samples from Valin's autopsy be made available so the forensic pathologist Dr. Bernard Knight would do an independent review of them and provide her findings. Their findings. I'm not sure on the sex there. The police would get in contact with Dr. Rasaya, who had done the autopsy. The doctor would go on to tell them that the samples had been sent to Charles Smith and that they had never been sent back to them after. It took many people working to get a hold of Charles Smith before he would go on to deny still having the slides. He would deny for over a year and hold up the process the whole time.
Wow.
Finally, the slides were found in his office, and they were passed on to Dr. Michael Polanen, who has now become the chief forensics pathologist of Ontario. Dr. Polanen decided to do a review of the slides himself and find that Smith's findings were completely wrong. He would find that the injuries to her body that had been attributed to physical and sexual abuse were the results of normal processes following the death or were caused by procedures connected to the post-mortem investigation. In particular, the dilation of her anal area that Smith had testified indicated that she had been sexually assaulted were actually a normal result of changes to her body after death and during the autopsy.
Wow.
Yeah. He would conclude that there was absolutely no evidence that Valin had been sexually abused or murdered. He would go on to say that he was unable to determine how the young girl had died, but would go on to say that there was no evidence to prove that she had died from anything other than natural causes. The slides and the evidence were handed over to Dr. Knight. Knight would agree to all the findings, include that Valin had died of natural causes.
Wow.
2003. Or I guess that's 2004 at that point.
Mm-hmm.
It's insane.
Yeah. With all of the new evidence in hand, Bill and Innocence Canada filed an application for what is called a ministerial review on September 7th, 2005. On September 21st, 2005, Bill would finally be granted bail while his application was being considered. He would finally step out of prison 11 years after being incarcerated for a crime that never happened. July 6, 2007 was the day that the Federal Minister of Justice would grant Bill's application and send the case back to Ontario Court of Appeals. Luckily for Bill, this court appearance was very different. It is now clear that there is no evidence that Mullins-Johnson was assaulted or murdered, and no evidence that Bill was guilty of any crime. Further, the court acknowledged that Bill had suffered a terrible miscarriage of justice. On October 15, 2007, Bill's conviction would be dropped, and he was acquitted of all charges. On October 20th, 2010, Chris Bentley, who was the Attorney General of Ontario, announced that Bill would be awarded $4.25 million in compensation for the wrongful conviction. Mr. Bentley apologized to Bill and his family on behalf of the Ontario government for the miscarriage of justice that occurred and the pain that he had to endure. Can you imagine?
No.
So this little bit here is taken right from the Innocence Project article. A few days before his release on bail, Bill told reporters that the day he was charged ripped my soul out, and right from the first allegation destroyed my life. On the day of his release, he explained that the last 12 years had been nothing but hell for me and my family. In a 2010 interview, Bill said that he might as well have been left in his prison cell because, in his words, I largely live the way I lived when I was inside, isolated and untrusting.
It's so sad.
Yeah, I know. It's brutal. Although Bill has regained his freedom, he has lost a decade of his life and suffered unimaginable anguish and undeserved stigma as his family, fellow inmates, and public at large believed that he had committed a horrific crime. In a sense, Bill is still behind bars. As a side note, it was from this case and others like it that the Innocence Canada became suspicious of Dr. Charles Smith. With the horribly flawed evidence he gave in this case and others, Innocence Canada in April 2005 wrote to Dr. Barry McClellan, then the Chief Coroner of Ontario, and Michael Bryant, the Attorney General, to ask for a public inquiry to be done. They wanted all of Smith's work to be looked at. On June 7th, 2005, the inquiry was announced. The report would state that Smith had no training in forensic pathology. They would also state that he was a terrible expert witness who had provided unbalanced or emotive testimony which tended to invite inappropriate and adverse conclusions. This in the end led to him being stripped of his medical license in Canada.
And I just wonder, like, how many other cases he could have been involved with where that, same happened.
Yeah, oh yeah. Well, I mean, like I said, of the 20 of the 44 that they actually looked into were flawed. And of those 44, 17 put people in jail. How many of those 20 that were proved to be faulty were those 17?
Mm-hmm.
It's crazy.
Yeah. And actually, another of the cases that I was looking into doing also included this shithead.
Wow.
He has a huge list of cases that he was involved with that are probably wrong in the end.
But it's like, how do you live with yourself, right? Like, or did he genuinely think he knew what he was doing and he's just an uneducated idiot, right? Mm-hmm. Like, did he think he was doing the right thing? Did he know?
Still, how do you live with yourself then?
But that's what I'm saying. Like, maybe he could live with himself because he thought he was actually right.
Yeah. But then when you lose your license, then you can really start thinking about it.
Yeah. Well, he's got a lot of free time on his hands, I'm sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Bicycle. 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 I wish I hadn't ridden my bicycle. Bicycle. Bicycle.
Oh, boy.
Oh, shit.
It's not often that both parties involved in a true crime case are victims, but that is what we're talking about today, so it's twice as sad. What a Debbie Downer I am.
Oh my.
Okay, with assistance from Mike, I've chosen a Rattler for this pairing. I'm going to let Mike talk about the specific Rattler we chose before I get into the history of Rattler.
Rattlers. All right, this is from Strathcona Beer Company. It's in the Strathcona neighborhood of Vancouver. This one's called Beach. It is a 4% alcohol rattler. It's a precise blend of fresh lemon and mandarin juice with beer. A light effervescent beer that is thirst-quenching and easy to drink with a tart, clean finish.
That sounds delicious.
And it is. Oh, open up. Like, I'll be surprised if Nina doesn't like this, so.
Oh.
It's drinkable. I like it. It's really fresh.
I haven't had it this year, but last year it was something I drank a little too much, probably. You can hear that carbonation, can't you?
Doesn't that sound nice?
Very similar color to the last one. It's maybe a little darker orange, but it's still pretty damn murky. Very lemony and orangey aroma. It smells like juice. It doesn't really smell like beer.
So good. Like, even the can looks refreshing.
Yeah, it does, yeah. It's got that, like, light lemon tartness. It's got lots of mandarin orange kind of things going on. Just a hint of grain. Little tart. Yeah, this is just easily crushable on the beach or whatever.
It says best kept refrigerated.
That's because there's a lot of juice in the mix.
But who's not keeping their beer in the fridge?
Well, the thing is that you have to be really careful with beers that have like fruit juice in them, because if there's any active yeast still in there, it'll start eating the juice up, and your can or bottle could explode if you're not careful. So the easiest thing to do is, even after you do your best to make sure there's no live yeast, is to say just keep it in the fridge.
Yeah.
Or just finish drinking it and don't return an open can to the fridge.
Oh, no. Like, it's the sealed cans that could be a problem.
Even still.
Because the yeast,
who's buying a 6-pack and not drinking them?
Well, but it's also like the flats of the beer at the liquor store, right?
The
better off being
the advice
store
is
cold.
for the store.
Everything. All the way through.
I know, I'm just busting your chops. Okay. So the Radler was originally created in the 1920s by a German innkeeper named Franz Kugler. A large group of cyclists had arrived at his tavern. They were exhausted and parched for beer. He quickly realized that he wouldn't have enough to quench the crowd's thirst. Quick solution? He added sparkling lemonade to his kegs and coined his drink Radler, which is the German word for cyclist. You'll soon understand the connection to my story.
Bicycle.
Mm-hmm.
Bicycle.
Cheryl Lynn Harper was born on August 31st, 1946 in Moncton, New Brunswick. In July of 1957, the family relocated to the RCAF base in Clinton, Ontario. That's the Royal Canadian Air Force, for those of you outside of Canada. It's about 80 kilometers north of London, which also won't mean much for those people outside of Canada, but that's okay. Lynn's spare time was spent going to Sunday school, Bible class, and Girl Guides. Busy.
Yeah, for sure.
Stephen Murray Truscott was born January 18, 1945 in Vancouver, BC. He was a classmate of Lynn's in a 7-8 split class at the Air Vice Marshal Hugh Campbell School, which was on the north side of the Air Force Base. In the early morning of June 9, 1959, Stephen gave Lynn a ride on the crossbar of his bicycle, riding away from the school along the county road. He would be the last known person to see her alive. The exact details, including start time and longevity of the ride, would be debated for years to come. At 11:20 p.m. that night, Lynn's father reported her missing. On the afternoon of June 11, Lynn's body was found in a nearby woodlot. She had been raped and strangled with her own shirt. She was only 12 years old.
Oh, man.
God.
In court, two versions of the bicycle timeline emerged. According to the Crown, Stephen and Lynn left the county road before they reached the bridge that goes over the Bayfield River. They then entered the adjacent wooded area called Lawson's Bush, where Stephen raped and murdered Lynn. According to Stephen and his defense team, he had taken Lynn to the intersection of County Road and Highway 8, where he left her unharmed. When he got back to the bridge, he looked back and saw her entering a late model Chevrolet that had a lot of chrome and was probably a Bel Air. This information was passed on to police the first time at 9:30 a.m. on June 10th, the day before Lynn's body was discovered. This interview took place in a police cruiser outside of Stephen's school, where Constable Hobbs had just pulled Stephen out of class.
Are they allowed to even do that, to interview a minor without... No.
Well, this was a long time ago, though.
Yeah, this was,
I guess,
late 50s, and, like, Stephen would have just done whatever the police told him to do.
Fair enough, yeah.
Like, we need to talk to you right now. Yeah, you're the police, you know what to do.
Right.
He would have just trusted them. On June 12th, shortly after 7 p.m., Stephen was taken into custody. 7.5 hours later, he was charged with first-degree murder under the Juvenile Delinquents Act. On June 30th, this charge was changed so that Stephen would be tried as an adult. An appeal to this charge was filed, but dismissed. Stephen was 14 years old.
Wow.
Unbelievable.
That is crazy, yeah. So young.
His parents never doubted his innocence. They knew that their son had nothing to do with such a horrendous crime. Sadly, shortly after Stephen's arrest, the military transferred his father to a base in Ottawa, which was 800 kilometers away. They wouldn't be deterred. They rented a trailer in Godric near the courthouse so that they could still be there for Stephen.
Good for them.
Yeah. So I just want to make sure everyone is, like, following the timeline of this supposed investigation. So they went from a young girl missing to charging a 14-year-old boy with a murder in less than 4 days.
Wow.
I'm not saying that you can't find the right criminal in that amount of time, but just wait and see what the arrest was based on and what the long-term effects were on everyone involved. So Stephen's trial started September 16th, 1959, in the Supreme Court of Ontario, which was located in Godric at the time. That's why his parents got that trailer nearby. Frank Donnelly was representing Stephen, and Glenn Hayes appeared for the Crown. All the evidence presented by the Crown was circumstantial. They were extremely focused on placing Lynn's death within the impossibly small window of just half an hour. That was the time that Lynn and Stephen were together. It was only half an hour. So Lynn left home at 6:15 p.m., met Stephen at 7 p.m. She asked him for a ride out to the highway. She had had a fight with her parents and knew a spot just off the highway where she could go see some horses. Stephen had no problem agreeing, since he was heading out that way anyway to see if any of his friends were down by the stream. Stephen was seen back on the base by 8 p.m., and was home for the rest of the night. Considering travel time on the bicycle, Lynn's death would have had to occur between 7:15 p.m. and 7:45 p.m. for Stephen to be the murderer.
Mm-hmm.
So the key piece of evidence was the testimony of John Peniston. He was the pathologist that performed the autopsy. According to him, Lynn had died in the exact timeline that she was with Stephen, and he could tell this by the state of decomposition and by how digested her food was, the food in her stomach was. That level of precision is completely unrealistic.
Yeah, no, it's bullshit.
Yeah.
Like, even for the tests available today, it's unrealistic, let alone what was available in 1959.
Yeah, you can get, like, the day or couple days from when they think it was, but not hours or half an hour.
Half an hour? Within a half an hour? No. What a load. On top of that, the actual autopsy report was never entered into evidence. The findings were only reported as part of his verbal testimony. Over the years, many officials have doubted the validity of his testimony, including Dr. Peniston himself.
What?
He later said that the death could have occurred 12 hours or maybe even more after the half an hour that he had originally testified to.
Was he pressured into saying half an hour? Like, what the hell?
I couldn't find anything that implied that he was pressured.
Yeah, I'm just surprised that isn't the same doctor involved in my case. Jesus.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
When you were telling your case, there were some similarities, but I mean, it's like Ontario criminal system, so there would be some overlap. But anyway, So the ridiculous medical testimony just goes on from there, because 3 days after the murder, 2 doctors had examined Stephen, and both testified in court to having seen injuries to his penis. They claimed to have seen 2 large lesions, each the size of a quarter. Quote, "The worst lesions I have ever seen," end quote. As a 14-year-old boy, hearing this in court was absolutely mortifying to Stephen. He was literally speechless.
Yeah, I would be too. Holy shit.
As an adult, he's comfortable in saying that these claims were ridiculously exaggerated and that he now realizes that it was just a ploy to shock some of the more prudish jurors.
Yeah.
This would have been easily proven at the time, as Stephen had a full examination when he was brought into the Huron County Jail in Godric. The doctors there observed, quote, "no sign of injury,"
Jeez.
end quote. Furthermore, there's no forensic science that rape even produces sores like those supposedly found on Stephen. So even if there were markings like what was described,
It wouldn't have
doesn't
come
mean
from
it was
that.
from rape. Could have been from a 14-year-old boy masturbating. Like,
Yeah.
big shock.
Never happens, right?
Oh, God.
So this is especially interesting because there are case notes taken very early on in the investigation that indicate that the police should be on the lookout for someone with visible scratch marks on their face, arms, neck, and etc., as it was clear that Lynn had put up a fight.
And he had, I'm assuming, none of that.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, his examination upon entering jail showed no visible injuries. So, how's that possible?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So not only were there no marks on Stephen, it was part of the prosecutor's case that he lured her into the woods, knocked her out, dragged her body over a barbed wire fence, carried her deeper into the woods before raping and killing her. But if that was the case, how were there so many clear signs that she had put up a fight? If she'd been if she'd been knocked out before she knew what was going on. Doesn't make any sense.
No, it doesn't, yeah.
They're just adding, subtracting evidence so that it would fit their case.
But also he did all of that in 30 minutes. And
Exactly.
Why? Right? Like,
Yeah. Perfect example. Within 15 minutes of the supposed time of death, Stephen was back at the schoolyard as witnessed by numerous kids. No scratches, no dirt, no blood, not acting weird. He's not winded at all. Nothing out of the ordinary. Not only was he not eliminated as a suspect, it wasn't mentioned in trial at all. That he was seen not 15 minutes later by this large group of kids, not mentioned in trial at all.
wow. I mean, how do you explain that, right? Like,
Yeah.
and how come his lawyers wouldn't have brought something up like that during trial?
Yeah, that's
I don't
surprising.
know. There's a lot of that in this case where I'm just like, were you even trying? Like, I don't understand. There were a few witnesses for Stephen that did make it to trial. Doug Oates was absolutely positive about when and where he saw Stephen and Lynn the day of this horrendous crime. He was only 11 at the time, but his testimony never changed, even under brutal cross-examination. Another boy, Gordon Logan, 12 years old, also saw Stephen and Lynn drive by, heading towards the highway, and then saw just Stephen heading back towards the base. This is especially significant as Gordon had reported it to police before Lynn's body was found. Later, when this timeline muddied the story, the prosecution just claimed that he was lying to protect his friend, and that from where he was standing, he couldn't have possibly seen who was on the bridge. Years later, police records were found by CBC's The Fifth Estate, which clearly stated that the police had performed a test to see if Gordon could have seen who was on the bridge. The results of this test were that, yes, it was completely possible to identify someone from that distance. This test was also not presented in court. On September 30th, the jury found Stephen guilty but recommended mercy. Justice Ferguson opted to ignore this recommendation and sentenced Stephen to death by hanging. Stephen's new lawyer, John G. O'Driscoll, filed an appeal on January 21st, 1960. It was dismissed, but Stephen's sentence was commuted to life imprisonment instead of hanging.
At least there's that.
Yeah. The death penalty would remain legal in Canada until July 14th, 1976. It could still be used as a sentence under the National Defense Act, but that was also abolished on December 10th, 1998.
Ooh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah. The death penalty was last implemented December 11th, 1962, when Ronald Turpin, 29, and Arthur Lucas, 54, was simultaneously hung for unrelated murders.
2-for-1 sale.
BOGO.
BOGO.
Those two were actually guilty, though.
And that's why we can joke about it.
Stephen started his sentence at the Huron County Jail in Goderic, where he remained until his death sentence was commuted. From there, he served about 3 years in a youth facility. In January of 1963, Stephen turned 18 and was therefore transferred to an adult facility. In his case, this facility was Collins Bay Penitentiary in Kingston. It was a huge adjustment for Stephen. There were a lot of changes, but one thing would never change. He was still very vocal about his innocence.
Yeah, I would be too.
The psychiatrists there were sure that they could get him to realize the truth. And he was sure that he already knew what the truth was, so he agreed to whatever test they wanted to do. This included subjecting him to LSD and truth serum, neither of which changed what he had to say, that he was innocent.
Like, it's country-sponsored drug use. I don't know.
Yeah, it's so weird. Like LSD.
What is truth serum? Is the LSD or is it two different?
Two different things. Yeah. I forget what the chemical name.
What was that called? Ross mentioned it the other day.
Yeah.
Or other episode.
Yeah.
Isn't it the sodium thiopentanol?
Yes.
Something like that?
Anyway, it's a drug that it like inhibits you from lying.
Right. Interesting.
In theory.
Yeah. By the mid-60s, the kids that Stephen had grown up with were adults, and some of them remembered his case. Remembered that he was their age, realized that they could have been him. In 1966, Isabelle Laborde released a book called The Trial of Stephen Truscott. Her book criticized the supposed investigation and reignited the public's interest in the case. On April 26, 1966, the case was referred to the Supreme Court of Canada for reassessment. By October of 1966, there was a trial. This trial included 5 days of evidence, including Stephen's testimony, as well as further submissions in January 1967. Stephen didn't get to testify at his first trial. He did testify at this trial, but it didn't go so well. Stephen had no one to really prep with for this trial, and he had spent years being told, no one believes you, you're not really innocent, so he couldn't have been less ready for
They didn't give him a
trial.
Decent lawyer to prep with?
Nope.
Like, what the hell?
Nope. There were 25 other witnesses, but on May 4th, 1967, the court still found that if Truscott's appeal had been heard by the court at the time, it still would have been dismissed. The vote was 8-1 against Stephen. He was returned to prison to serve the rest of his sentence. 2.5 years later, on October 21st, 1969, he was paroled. He had served 10.5 years of his sentence. He moved to Kingston and lived with his parole officer. He then briefly lived in Vancouver before settling in Guelph under an assumed name. He got married and raised 3 children. His parole conditions were eventually released November 12, 1974. Stephen led his life quietly under his assumed name until 2000, when he agreed to an interview on the aforementioned The Fifth Estate. When his interview aired, the interest in Stephen's case skyrocketed. By November 2001, James Lockyer led the Association of the Defense Against the Wrongly Convicted to file an appeal to have the case reopened. In January 2002, retired Quebec Justice Fred Kaufman was chosen to review the case. On October 28, 2004, Justice Minister Irwin Cotler directed Ontario to review whether new evidence would have changed the 1959 verdict. The case moved along relatively slowly. On April 6, 2006, Lynn's body was exhumed to test for DNA evidence. I can't imagine what the Harper family was going through at this point.
Yeah, no.
They had always trusted that the police and courts had gotten it right the first time, so this would have been impossibly hard for them. To make matters worse, there was no usable DNA found.
Yikes.
During the review, Justice Michael Moldaver asked retired OPP officer Harry Sayu, he had assisted the original inspector Harold Graham, quote, "Did the thought ever cross your mind that for someone to strangle her, then sexually assault her, you might want to be looking for someone who is more of a pervert, more of a sexual psychopath?" End quote. How the hell did it take 47 years for someone to ask this? Officer Harry's response, quote, "I don't recall that." End quote.
Talk about lack of justice.
With what was done to her, you didn't think maybe it might not have been this 14-year-old boy who had no criminal record whatsoever?
Yeah, exactly.
Didn't occur to you. Really? Okay. Stephen's conviction was officially brought to the Court of Appeal for Ontario June 19th, 2006. His defense team was asking for Stephen to be found innocent as opposed to not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Part of the evidence heard was earlier versions of draft autopsy reports that completely contradicted what Dr. Peniston had testified about. His own notes had actually provided 3 different estimated time of deaths for Lynn.
Jesus. I am so sure about this, I'm going to give you 3 different versions.
Exactly. So 2 of these times would have excluded Stephen completely, and it was only after Stephen became a suspect that the, quote, official report indicated that the time was when Stephen and Lynn were together.
Those 30 minutes.
Yeah. On August 28, 2007, Stephen was acquitted of the charges, but the court felt that the defense hadn't proven factual innocence. So while being found not guilty was a step forward, it did still mean that Stephen was considered a suspect in the now unsolved murder of Lynn Harper. So who else was considered a suspect in the murder? Literally no one. The police only had Stephen as a suspect in an area where many men were coming and going regularly, some of which with criminal backgrounds. The only suspect was a 14-year-old boy. So who should have been a suspect? A very clear suspect was found in 1965 by Flight Lieutenant Willard Bud Longley. He found a misfiled psychiatric file from 1959 and was very disturbed by it. He was aware of the Harper case, and according to this file, this man seemed like an obvious suspect. On top of that, this man had been hospitalized for a mental breakdown shortly after the murder took place, but got permission from his commanding officer to investigate further. The 3-month investigation was on Alexander Kalachuk. Some of the following information is from Bud's investigation. Some of it is from the investigation that was done later by Fifth Estate. Alexander Kalachuk was an alcoholic with multiple sexual offenses who lived less than 20-minute drive from the Clinton base with his wife and 3 children. At the time of Lynn's death, he was not working at the Clinton base, but since he was a supply technician, he did make frequent trips back to Clinton for work. His record of sexual criminal offenses went back over a decade. In 1950, when he was staying in Trenton, he had 2 convictions for indecent exposure. Just a few weeks before Lynn's death, he was at it again. While driving along Country Road, he came across 3 school-aged girls. He stopped and tried to lure one of them into his car by offering her a gift of new underwear.
What?
She was 10 years old. He quickly left when he saw the girl's father approaching. He was soon arrested by the OPP and charged. A week later, a judge was forced to let him go for lack of evidence. The judge knew that something was not right, though, and basically told this guy that he knew he was up to no good and he needed to watch himself. 12 days later, Lynn Harper was raped and killed in an area where this piece of garbage was known to frequent.
Wow.
Yeah. Remember, Stephen had seen that he saw someone stop and pick up Lynn in a car. She may have even known this guy since her father was the senior supply officer at Clinton and worked directly with this guy.
Oh my God.
Bud also found out that Kalichuk had sold his car shortly after Lynn's murder. Not weird at all.
No.
No.
Not hiding evidence at all.
Nope.
Bud reported his findings to his commanding officer and then to Harold Graham, who had done the initial investigation into the case. Graham was not interested in Bud's investigation. While Bud was disgusted with what the file said, all he could do was refile it accordingly, and it was moved to the National Archives in Ottawa. That is where Fifth Estate found the 900-page bundle nearly 40 years later.
Wow.
Yeah, Kalichuk was never arrested, never questioned, never thought of as a suspect at all. Only a month after the murder, he was hospitalized for a mental breakdown. Seems like he must have had something horrible on his mind. I wonder what it was. When he was released, he continued preying on young girls from his car. His drinking worsened, and he was arrested multiple times for drunk driving. He eventually died in 1975 of alcoholism.
Good.
Jesus.
So if you're interested in reading more, I really recommend the book Until You Are Dead by Julian Scherer. It's one of the best true crime books I've ever read, and that's really saying something because I've read a lot of true crime books. But you should also watch this Fifth Estate episode, if not just for the information, for the amazing array of Canadian accents.
Nice.
That's the Stephen Truscott case. It's one of my favorite true crime cases. Horrible.
Yeah, for sure.
Like, horrible case. Still technically unsolved.
Awful.
Yep.
And we know who did it, but
Yeah.
he's never been proven to do it.
Yeah. Hey, this is Beck of Brew Crime fame. Well, not fame, but you know what I mean. I'm here to talk to you about Podcoin. We both know that you're going to listen to podcasts no matter who tries to stop you. You aren't the boss of me, Mom. This is the first podcast app that pays you to listen to your favorite podcasts. You can get the free Podcoin app on Android or iPhone, and it's super simple to use. You gain Podcoins that can be donated to charity or used to buy gift cards from places like Amazon or Starbucks. You're going to listen anyway, so why not make some cash while you're at it? If you use the invite code Brew Crime, you can even earn 300 bonus Podcoins just for signing up. You're welcome. So run, don't walk, to Podcoin and sign up now.
Okay, so for the wrongful convictions, I decided to talk about the Eastburn family massacre. I originally actually heard about this story on another true crime podcast known as Crime Junkies, and it got me just super stoked on it, and I can't believe it. I don't even know if I think he's guilty, if he's not guilty. I have no idea. So,
Owl theory.
That there were no animals used in this, but it was just a wild ride, this entire story. So I'm excited to tell it. For my beer pairing, I picked a beer, once again, strictly just by the name, called Strange Resemblance. My accused actually turned himself in because he thought he looked like the sketch.
What?
Wow.
So it was a strange resemblance. Mike, do you want to tell us about the beer?
Decision.
That is very freaking strange. Wow. All right. So speaking of strange resemblances, this beer is from Strange Fellows Brewing. It is a wild saison. It is 6.2% alcohol.
Doppelgangers are considered to be bad luck, even a harbinger of impending death. They could be a long-lost twin, of course, or merely one who bears a strange resemblance to you. Worst-case scenario, they are an evil twin from a parallel universe and intent on hijacking your life. If they don't cast a shadow or appear reflected in a mirror, then you know you're in trouble. This beer, with its fruity, bright character, will reveal treacherous intentions.
Womp, womp, womp. Looking at the bottle, it looks like the woman in the strange resemblance has a tattoo on her face. This beer looks much like the last one we had in the other episode. It's kind of a murky orange, little white head.
Theme of the day.
It's got kind of a funky fruit note to the nose. It's got a little bit of spices from the Saison yeast and the wild yeasts. A little bit of the floral notes from a Saison and grainy notes from a Saison. Let's try the flavor. It's nice and grainy, a little bit funky from that wild yeast. There's hints of the citrusy lemon going on. It's pretty dry. Kind of a little bit of puckering in the back of your mouth. Not a lot of fruit notes, but there's still some kind of hint of citrus or something in there. It's grainy. I like it, but I can't really explain what it is.
Mike had mentioned on the bottle that the woman on the bottle has a marking on her face. So I was like, oh, I wonder if that's part of the, history of doppelganger. Mm-hmm. So I Googled doppelganger face mark, but it just showed me a picture of Ed Sheeran and Rupert Grint. So that didn't help, but It was amusing.
It's a good Google search.
Yeah.
So the bottle says the aroma is ripe pineapple and lychee. And it says character is bright and fruity with a dry finish. I'm not sure I'm getting those fruits, but it is a dry finish, and I do like it. I'll happily drink it. Nina.
Mm-hmm. So to begin, Katie Eastburn was a military wife, and her husband was Gary Eastburn. Gary Eastburn is frequently away from home as he was attending an Air Force Capital Training School in Alabama. Gary had been offered a transfer to Germany, and the family was really excited about moving there. Really nerve-wracking, but huge move for them from the United States to Germany. But as a family, they were ready to go. The family was particularly sad that they had to leave their family dog Dixie behind, but the strict regulations prohibiting them from bringing a pet along. Katie had placed an ad in the classifieds in a local newspaper that services the Fort Bragg area, hoping to find a good, willing home to take Dixie in, and love Dixie just as much as they did. On Tuesday, May 7th in 1985, Staff Sergeant Timothy Hennis saw the ad that Katie had posted and contacted her to come pick up the dog. Tim spoke to his wife Angela, and they made the decision that they wanted a second pet in their home. They had just had a newborn daughter named Christina, and they wanted her to have a pet to grow up with her. The evening arrived when Kim went to the Eastburn home. He arrived at the house and asked Katie to go inside just to use the restroom. She obliged. There's reports here saying we're assuming that she thought it would be safe to let him into the home because he was a fellow military man, just as her husband. Mm-hmm. Everything turned out okay with this visit. Tim took Dixie, took a dog leash, ended up leaving really excited to introduce Dixie to his and Angela's daughter, Christina. Now, there honestly aren't any 100% accounts of what happened that Thursday evening, but what we absolutely do know is that Katie Eastburn and 2 of her 3 daughters were brutally murdered.
Well, that popped up on me.
Yep. So Katie was raped and killed. Her 2 daughters were stabbed and had their throats slit. Oh. And their youngest daughter, who was 22 months old, was left alive.
Wow.
Yep. On Sunday, May 12th, the Eastburns' next-door neighbor was a bit alerted, and they found it strange that there was newspapers piling up at the door, and there's also a baby stroller, of course, in their driveway that hadn't actually moved the entire time.
Yeah, it's odd.
Wait,
That's
what? How long later?
So on the 9th is when the murder happened. This was on the 12th. It's a few days later. So obviously this alerted some of the neighbors. One of the neighbors, who is Army Sergeant Bob Seafelt, I think it's pronounced, he walked up to their front door and actually heard crying coming from inside. He was pretty concerned, but the doors were all locked, so he couldn't actually get inside. So he actually ran back to his own house, got his phone, and called the babysitter for the family, who also lived close, just asked her to come over to see if she had a key and just to maybe help out. When Julie arrived, who was the babysitter, she peeked through a window and actually saw baby Jana standing alone in her crib.
Oh, shit.
The poor baby.
Yeah. At this point, they had wanted, obviously, to bust through the doors and go inside and get the baby. However, Sergeant Bob suggested that they probably call the police at this point before just walking inside and seeing all that, which they did. Once the police arrived, the first officer on scene was Officer William Toman, who ended up forcing open a window and retrieving the crying infant. He also grabbed just some diapers and handed Jana over to the sitter. From here, he actually noticed a really foul smell. Upon further investigation, he walked into the home and first saw Katie's 3-year-old daughter, Erin's dead body. From here, he called for further backup. Moving further into the house, he found the body of 5-year-old Cara. After finding her body, Katie's body was what was found last. The investigators were actually approached by a young black man named Patrick Cohn. He wanted to advise the police he actually saw a man leave the residence about 3 nights ago, which would have been the same night as the murders. Patrick said that he was walking home from his girlfriend's house at about 3:30 in the morning, and he saw a white Chevy parked on the road, and there was a, and I quote, white dude walking down the lady's driveway. He asked him what he was doing, and the gentleman just said that he's getting an early start on his morning, and he drove off. Patrick also provided a very thorough description of the man, that he was about 6'4", blonde hair, he had a black toboggan on, he was also wearing a black members-only jacket, white shirt, blue jeans. This last detail is particularly important to remember as it's going to play out later in the trial.
I was just going to say, toboggan's a toque.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't know what it was.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Where is the toboggan a toque?
Yeah, in the States.
Okay, I was
That's
just
what
like,
they call it.
I've heard beanie.
Yeah, it's the same. Same thing.
okay, I was going to
It's a
say
toque.
toque is a way easier word than this word. It
Yeah.
took me a while.
Yeah, I was just like, what is he wearing a toboggan for?
On his head, right? Ridiculous.
Why
Yeah.
is he going sledding?
You're not
Yeah.
suspicious at all.
It's a toque.
Yeah. So a few days after the murders, the police broadcasted on the TV, radio stations, just asking for more information of who this man is and if he can step forward, just as they have more questions for him. Now that leads us to Tim Hennis. He happened to be watching the evening news with his wife, and he noticed that he looked really, really close to the TV sketch. He also drove a white Chevy, and of course he was in the area that night, as this is where he had just been to pick up the dog Dixie.
Right.
At this point, Tim and his wife and their young daughter packed up and drove to the police station voluntarily to try and clear his name. Once he arrived at the police station, the police noticed that without a doubt, he looked exactly like the sketch. And I've seen the side-by-side comparison. It's him. For sure. Mm-hmm. It was, I mean, yeah.
But it wasn't 3 a.m. But it wasn't 3 a.m. This guy said he saw him leaving the house at 3 a.m.
3:30 a.m.
Well,
Yeah.
Yeah.
he wasn't picking up a dog at 3:30 in the morning.
No, but he had been at the house earlier that day, so
Yeah.
he's like, maybe. Mm-hmm. While Tim was at the police station, the police had asked him just to submit any DNA evidence, so some blood, hair, semen samples, which Tim willingly obliged. Of course, he didn't have an attorney present or anything. He was just trying to clear his name, so he gave them essentially anything that they asked for.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, always a bad idea. But
I mean, if your goal here was to just prove it had nothing absolutely to do with it, but hey, it's my face, and I can see that as a point of just wanting to move the investigation forward or being like, hey, I'm not the guy you're looking for, go talk to someone else, right?
oh yeah, no. But as this case proves, unfortunately, bad idea.
Yeah. Well, we'll see later if it was a bad idea or not.
Yeah, okay.
After Tim provided his DNA, gave all the samples the police had requested, and he was sent home. You know, Tim and his wife were recorded to just have a conversation that they were just really happy they did this, kind of move on with everything that was going on. Well, little do they know that that same day, the police showed back up at his door with an arrest warrant and arrested him. So let's jump to trial number 1.
No.
Tim immediately hired a high-profile lawyers considered to be the best criminal defense attorneys in the state of North Carolina. Right away, their game plan was to go over how the evidence was gathered and to try to disprove the witness testimony provided by Patrick. These hotshot lawyers even hired a private detective to research and see what they can figure out or come up with other alternative that could have led up to the events. Tim, of course, did admit to being in the home prior and using the washroom and, of course, leaving with the dog. Tim's lawyers found several flaws in this case. There were several hairs and fingerprints found at the scene that were not a match to Tim, nor any of the Eastburn family. Also, there was a size 9 shoe print uncovered by police, which no way could have been Tim's as he had the size 13 feet.
Wow.
They also hired world-renowned forensic expert Paul Stonebach. When Paul arrived at the Eastburn home, he actually ended up finding a condom wrapper, which was not discovered by the police, and it was actually under the dresser. Now, he did say that it's really unusual for a rapist to bring condoms when committing their violent acts. Additionally, after spending several hours in the home, Paul came to a conclusion with what the layout was and from what he was seeing with the physical evidence in the house, that there was probably 2 assailants to do all of this. During this time, they also found out that Katie Eastburn's credit card had gone missing. There was exactly $300 that was withdrawn from her account. This led to further suspicion onto Tim, as he was actually exactly $300 short in his rent, which he paid off May 10th. So the very following day, he had the exact same amount. So it didn't look good. Tim lawyers went to the ATM machine and actually interviewed a lady by the name of Lucille Cook. She used the ATM machine around the same time, and originally she didn't report seeing anyone there or noticing anything. The assumption was that he stole her card and went to withdraw money. Lastly, they had also interviewed Chuck and Sherry Radke, and they claimed that they were also out the early morning, the same time that Patrick was out, and that not only did they not see Patrick, they didn't see anyone else on the streets. They did mention that they saw a few days prior a blonde man with a crew cut wearing a black beret and a black members only jacket carrying a black garbage bag over his shoulder, turning down the street at the same time the Eastburn murders would have occurred. After all of this was presented to the jury, it only took them 12 hours to deliberate, and they came back with a guilty verdict on July 4th in 1986 on 1 count of first-degree rape and 3 counts of first-degree murder. Tim was sentenced to 3 death penalties.
Wow.
Yep. So let's jump to trial number 2. Tim was booked and brought into Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina. Soon as he arrived, he actually received a mysterious postcard from someone who was claiming that they did the offense and that they were super happy that he's just taking the buck for them and that he's the one doing the crime. Tim's attorneys honestly originally thought that it was just a bit of a hoax, but they kept it in evidence just in case. Apparently, also, the prosecution received an identical postcard, but they continued to deny it. It was even requested in other discovery motions, and they're just pretending that never happened. Never got it. Tim ended up spending 2 years on death row, and his conviction was finally overturned, and he was sent back to the courts for a retrial, which began on February 27th in 1989. So the reason that his original sentence was overturned is his lawyers were able to argue that during the original trial, the prosecution showed, they spent almost more than 90 minutes showing the gruesome pictures of the scene.
Yeah.
And they just believed that with how gruesome everything was and with how terrifying the scene was, that anyone who's in that room, as for the jurors, you're just going to convict anyone because some monster, awful person did this.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
Absolutely. And the judge agreed with them and ordered the retrial. So some things had changed from trial number 1 to trial 2. Prosecutors now introduced another witness, Elisa Peabody, who was also from the same neighborhood, and she previously stated she saw no one at the night of the murders, but now all of a sudden she's adamant she saw Tim. Another witness who I mentioned earlier, Lucille Cook, the one who was at the ATM machine, well, now she's changed her story, and now all of a sudden Tim was there, and she did see Tim.
Gee, I wonder if they saw pictures of him, and that mysteriously jogged their memory.
Yeah, so Tim's lawyers were able to easily disprove hers because they were able to see the timestamps on the ATM machine. So they were able to prove that she was just lying. She was just full of it.
Or just misremembering.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, you first remember absolutely nothing, and now all of a sudden it's exactly this person and you're pinpointing him.
Unfortunately, it happens a lot, though, where people think one thing and then they hear enough about a case and then suddenly they think they thought something else, right?
Yeah, it's definitely not a good thing.
No.
The defense for Tim also hired another private eye, O'Malley, and unbelievable twist of fate here, he was actually able to find an exact look-alike to Tim, whose name was John Ropach. Last name is spelled Raupach, so I think I'm pronouncing it correctly.
Probably.
But this was the gentleman that actually Chuck and Sherry saw.
Huh.
They actually had John enter the courtroom, and he looked straight up like Tim's twin. He was 6'4", he wore a black members-only jacket, he had a black toboggan or toque, white t-shirt on, and corduroy pants. He was actually also known to carry his book bag over his shoulder, just like they said. They saw that gentleman that night. Given everything that the defense had presented this time in court, Tim Hennis was acquitted on all accounts. From here on, he was a free man.
Nice.
The story doesn't end here. So Tim was acquitted in 1989. He's a free man. So now we're going to jump all the way to 2007. Army officials decided to reopen the case after experts claimed that they had DNA evidence from the 22-year-old murder that tied Tim to the crime. At this point, Tim was 49 years old, and he had actually already retired from the military, but he was forcefully reactivated to stand trial under military jurisdiction. The reason this had to happen is because of double jeopardy.
Yeah.
Prevented the state officials from retrying Tim. So even with the discovery of new evidence, the federal government is considered a separate authority unto itself and therefore separates its powers from the state. So obviously, if you remember me earlier saying that Tim had offered free samples, semen samples, everything. Well, obviously the DNA testing wasn't what it was before, and here they were able to test the semen samples found in Katie, and 12,000 million to one certainty that it does belong to Tim. Now, originally Tim stuck with his story that he just visited to the Eastburns to get the dog. He answered the classified. Well, now all of a sudden he's changing it that he was actually there that night and he had consensual sex with her. He said that the reason he didn't want to disclose that he was there and that they had consensual sex, he didn't want to add any further grief to Gary, so Katie's husband, and their surviving daughter, Jana.
Yeah.
As was, he didn't want to, air his dirty laundry that he's, stepping out on his wife.
Mm-hmm.
So the third trial is a bit different. They didn't need eyewitness testimony this time around. They had his semen, places him there with DNA, and unfortunately now he also looks like a liar.
Yeah.
Right? He left that part out, and now that's changed. So with all of this added up, in 2010, Tim was found guilty on 3 counts of premeditated murder. Tim Hennis is currently on death row at the Army facility in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. His attorneys are presently working on his appeals to go on for years, possibly even reaching the United States Supreme Court. I feel that this case will have obviously more stories and more developments that we still aren't confirmed. There's still a lot of debate whether he's guilty or if he's not guilty. They still haven't been able to prove where all the other DNA samples came from, because the other hair that was found and things does not match him.
Mm-hmm.
If Tim is telling the truth that it was consensual sex, who then could it be?
Mm-hmm.
I don't understand. Yeah, I don't understand why he would turn himself in why he would give all his samples, why he'd be so open with like, yeah, I was there and all of this. The eyewitness testimony doesn't quite make sense to me. They either saw him, they didn't see him, they couldn't pinpoint the night. I don't know. I feel that I don't know if he's guilty or not. I don't know what's going to happen with this case. So, could be a wrongful conviction. Again, for his third trial. He's going to go into a fourth trial. Who knows?
We'll find out, I guess.
Mm-hmm. It's a weird little loophole for double jeopardy.
Yeah. Well, it did, and it also only applied to him because he was in the military. Had he not been, too bad, too sad, essentially. Mm-hmm. But yeah, his case was one of the standout cases where something like this happened, where one trial, second trial, and now third trial under different jurisdictions. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I'm confused. I mean, I can understand his reasoning for not declaring that there was, as he says, consensual sex. However, if he was so forthcoming with everything else, why didn't he just say that, right? Yeah. Yeah, obviously it can ruin his marriage potentially, change how maybe people look at Katie if it was consensual sex, but I don't understand how you would give your semen and all your DNA samples and all that and not expect it to be found if you did have consensual sex. So,
well, I mean, if the condom was his or whatever, then he would think, well, they're not going to find anything. So.
Well, yeah, I guess maybe because of the condom, they didn't expect to find any of that.
Yeah.
But I mean, did the condom even have anything to do with it, though, right? Like,
who knows? Yeah. If it did, though, it seems odd.
Well, and I think it was
It's all odd. It's all odd.
It sounds murky. It sounds sketchy. Yeah. And what the private investigator that they had go in who found that, who, based on seeing it, he thought it was two assailants. They weren't really able to pin down because all the girls were stabbed, their throats slit. I mean, that takes some kind of monster, an animal.
Yeah, it does seem odd that he went from, I mean, you didn't mention any previous criminal activity.
Absolutely none.
Right, so to go from none to rape and triple homicide?
And children, and I mean,
that's
the daughter...
Big jump.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
It's a really fucking big jump.
The daughter that was left alive was as old as his daughter. Mm-hmm. So, family man, after he was acquitted, after the second trial, he actually went back to serve in the military, retired good, zero problems, ever.
Yeah, it's all odd.
Super clean record. So I don't understand what takes someone to just, I don't want to say snap and go to this level, or...
But then never again?
Usually you always reoffend at that point, though, right?
Well, it's like you've crossed that line.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's all weird.
I don't know. I think it's just... I don't know. But yeah. It was definitely shocking seeing the resemblance of the look-alike they found from him. Mm-hmm. Obviously, they tested his DNA too. He wasn't there or anything, but it also makes you try to always second guess those, eyewitness statements and all of that. But who knows? Mm-hmm. So yeah.
Well, but yeah, listening to podcasts with former FBI agents, eyewitness accounts are almost garbage. Like almost always just useless.
So easily tainted.
Yeah. So.
Well, it looks like from this story, though, the original man that had stepped up to the police, Patrick, what he said lines up with what he saw. Because now all of a sudden, Tim did put himself, I guess, in that situation, right? So it kind of makes sense. Mm-hmm. But, I mean, how do you have a witness 1 year say, no, there was no one there? Now all of a sudden, I remember seeing this person specifically here. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's like, okay, well...
Strange that your memory become more clear years later.
But I mean, sometimes that can happen with for people who suffer from PTSD or things do come back to them. But
But there would be no PTSD from visiting the ATM.
Yeah.
You're seeing your bank account.
Yeah.
And you're like,
I don't know. I definitely get some PTSD at the
bank. No, so I don't, it sounds fishy to me. I mean, it could have been consensual sex if the only thing was that, but nothing else tied him to the scene. He went back home that day. Like he was covered in blood. And I mean, I didn't look into it, but I think, if I'm remembering correctly, that when people do have knife crimes, that they always sometimes cut themselves because sometimes the hand can slide down. None of that.
You're right. Yeah.
So I don't know.
Weird.
I don't know if there's still a crazy lunatic out there. So yeah.
There's lots of crazy lunatics out there.
Well, yes, there is.
Mm-hmm. There are lots on the spectrum, as you said, right? So, yeah. And that's what I got for you guys today.
All right. Well, thanks for tuning in to our Wrongful Convictions episode. If you want to find us online, you can find us at brewcrime.com. Find us on social media at Brew Crime. So that's on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can find us at Pacific Beer Chat. You can find us at Brew Crime at pacificbeerchat.com. You can find our merch at Threadless, brewcrime.threadless.com. You can also find us on patreon.com at patreon.com/brewcrime. You can support us and help us upgrade our equipment and do more cool things. So thanks to our Patreon supporters, the faves of our lives, Amber and 3 Beers In Podcast. Cheers for listening.
Woohoo.
Woohoo! Brew Crime's intro was created by Mike using Creative Commons Attribution licensed audio from purple-planet.com, soundbible.com, and freesoundeffects.com. Logo design was by Ben Greenberg. All cases and stories were written by Beck, Nina, and Mike, and our sources are put into the show notes for each episode. We always want to give credit to the people that research the cases we talk about. Check out our store at brewcrime.threadless.com, where you can purchase swag like t-shirts, phone cases, beach towels, and all kinds of cool stuff. We can also be found on your favorite podcast apps, our hosts, Spreaker.com, or brewcrime.com, as well as at Brewcrime on Twitter, at Brewcrime on Facebook, at facebook.com/groups/brewcrime. Thanks for listening. This has been a production of Pacific Beer Chat. Here's a promo from one of the podcasts in the Big Heads Media Network.
I'm Midnight Agent Raw.
And I'm Okame.
We are the Super Media Bros podcast.
Each week, we give a comedically informative take on movies,
Music,
television,
video games,
and much more.
Put your shades on and listen to all episodes on supermediabrospodcast.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Yeah,
Shades on.
we're off.
In 1957, Laika became the first animal to orbit Earth. What kind of animal was Laika?
What is the only team in the Big Four North American sports leagues which shares its name with one of the Avengers?
And here's one more question for you. Are you the type of person who enjoys playing trivia games, learning new things, and having a bit of fun along the way?
If you are, or if you just want to find out the answers to those other questions, then our podcast, Quiz and Hers, might be right up your alley.
Each week, one of us writes new trivia questions for the other person, covering everything from science to history to pop culture to sports.
And every question in a game relates to some theme, like Game of Thrones,
Internet memes,
sandwiches,
or animals in space.
Some of the themes make more sense than others.
So if you like trivia, learning, or real couples testing each other's knowledge and patience, check out our podcast, Quiz and Hers, part of the Big Heads Media Podcast Network.
Quiz and Hers, the trivia podcast where we test each other's knowledge and the strength of our relationship.
Excuse me, Nina.
Hey.
Sorry, one sec. Bad sentence.
It happens to us all.
Me more than others.
Debatable.
You're doing a draft right now.
Yeah, because there's so many bad sentences.
Yeah, I don't do that though. Connecting to Bill, or when you copy and paste, doesn't always go well. Damn quotes.
Tell me about it.
On September 21st, 2005, Bill would finally be granted bail while his a pup.
His a pup.
I largely live in a way
You bought it.
Oh, that's right.
Beach.
Yeah.
You bought it, beach.
Beach.
Beach. Nina will like this one.
Uh-oh. Nina will like it.
No, you'll like this one. This thing's...
Back, I'm going to pour the rest of my beer into yours.
I'm never using that red microphone.
Yeah,
Always belching on it. Rubbing your beard. It's grody.
She's been belching on that one, though.
Your belches.
Not like
I
you.
have girly belches. They're ladylike.
Your belches
Lady
are not
belch.
gendered.
Don't you assume the gender of my burps?
I said they're
It's a
not
spectrum.
gendered.
It's a spectrum.
Yes.
Okay.
I didn't know belches were a spectrum.
Know what gender is. So.
Yes.
Okay.
Little,
Me?
There's a
Yeah.
quiet
Me? You?
burp, and then
Me?
there's the...
Mine's long, so
21st, 1960. It was dismissed by Stephen... No, sorry. I'm going to say that again. On September 30th, they found...
Even a harbinger of impending death.
Harbinger. Hairbringer.
Hairbringer.
Words.
Start again.
Doppelgangers are considered to be bad luck. Here, why don't you read this?
Sure.
And then I'll talk about the beer when I can speak again.
Doppelgangers are considered to be bad luck. Oh my god. Holy Christ.
Not just
It's really
me.
loud.
Okay, so let's get into it. So the Katie Eastburn... I missed sentences. Sorry, I missed words. Okay, we'll start that again. Scratch.
Remix. As you would say.
Yeah, remix.
We need to get a shirt with remix on
Right.
it.
Yeah. Who was free? Nope. Remix, no. Okay, I'm just going to start that again.
Remix.
Okay.
And we arrive back at the same spot.
Yeah, that's okay.
We'll get there. It's fine.
Did I say that part? Yes. Okay. Elisa Peabody, who was a neighbor. Sorry. It says here, who's a neighborhood?
Who is a neighborhood?
Okay, I'll just start that again. I have Mr. O'Malley. O'Malley, maybe?
Probably O'Malley.
Even after the discovery of the so-called new evidence, the federal government is considered a silver authority. Sorry, no. Places him in the DNA on all 3 counts of premeditated.
Premeditated? You can also email us at feedback at... Or no, you can't. I did it right.